Good evening, everyone. I am Momita Pal, welcoming you on behalf of Tell Me Your Story to the stories of floods and displacement under TMYS Review September 2021. We are calling for submissions of stories, essays, and poems as a part of the project. Today, we are very privileged to have Nishi Pulugurtha, Shelly Bhoil, and Sumana Roy to discuss poetry of floods and environmental activism. Deyasini will be in conversation. Nishi Pulugurtha is an academic and creative writer and writes on travel, film, short stories, poetry, and on Alzheimer's disease. Her work has been published in various journals and magazines. Her publications include a monograph on Derosio 2010, a collection of essays on travel, Out in the Open 2019, an edited volume of essays on travel, Across and Beyond 2020, and a volume of poems, The Real and the Unreal and Other Poems 2020. She is now working on her first volume of short stories. We welcome you, Nishidi. We also have Shelly Bhoil joining us today. She is a writer, Indian writer and scholar living in Brazil. Her publications include an emo from her poem Writers Workshop India 2016, co-editor of Tibetan Subjectivities on Global Stage Lexington Books US 2018, editor of New Narratives Exile Tibet Lexington Books 2020, and Preposição de Entendimento Urtau Brazil forthcoming. We welcome you, Shelly. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Momita.
And we also have Sumana Roy today. Sumana Roy is the author of How I Become a Tree, a work of non-fiction, Missing a Novel, Out of Syllabus Poems, and My Mother's Lover and Other Stories, a collection of short stories. We welcome you, Shomana Dwi. Thank you for joining us. Deyasini will be in conversation with all of them. Deyasini is an award-winning young poet who hails from Chandanagar, West Bengal. She has recently completed her postgraduate degree in English and Comparative Literature from Pondicherry University, India. She is published in several national and international journals of repute. She was conferred with the South Asian Literary Award by Sahitya Deshkal, the Mirror of Time, on 3rd November 2019, and has recently won the Nobel laureate Kabir Rabindranath Tagore Award for Poetry in February 2020. Welcome you all. Thank you for joining. I now hand it over to Deyasini to take the conversation ahead. Thank you.
Deyasini, may I add something to what Momita said?
Sure.
I wanted to say that Nishidi's book is no longer forthcoming. It's come out, her book of short stories. I just saw a Facebook post. It has a beautiful cover.
Thank you I saw so too. The windowsill, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Nishi.
Beautiful. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Momita, for your kind words. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure having you amongst us today. And as we know, our topic for today is poetry of floods and environmental activism. I would like to begin today's session with a quote by E.M. Foster. Art, says Foster, is valuable not because it is educational, not because it is recreative. It is valuable because it has to do with order. It creates a little world of its own, possessing eternal harmony in the bosom of this disordered planet. The function of art, I believe, is essentially to channelize the human mind from the labyrinths of materialistic and mundane muddle towards intellectual maturity and spiritual integrity to define the need of practicing human values in a deeper metaphysical sense to value nature preservation and human attachment. I quote, to place at a local, communitarian, or bioregional level and to affirm an ecocentric or biocentric ethics, often intensified by an innate bond, whether biological, psychological, spiritual, harmonizing the individual being and the natural world. Initially, we would like to hear from you about the role of poetry in reorienting environmental activism.
I was looking at your questions which you sent forward in the mail, and that's let me thinking. And as I look back at the kind of poems that we read right from school onwards, and if I try to go back, I did try to look at a few of them, and I saw that most of them have been talking about the environment in various ways. And I think it's there. It's just up to us to read the poems, read the nature images that are there in those poems, more carefully. So they always have been there in any kind of poem that you have read, right from school onwards, through college, university. Any kind of nature image that a poet uses, any kind of metaphor, any kind of analogy to the natural world, you find that he or she is talking about various aspects of nature that affected them, and presenting things. I'm just reminded of the rhyme of the ancient mariner, where that killing of the albatross brings about so much of change. And you could actually read that poem as talking about the environment, about nature, and the fact that we need to be very careful about how we react to nature around us. So I think any kind of poem that we read, I mean, all we have to do is read them very carefully. Yesterday I had a student presenting a paper at a college event on World Environment Day, and she was referring to religious texts, to Kabir's Dohas, and to the Quran, to the Bible, where she was pointing out how they're always there. What is important, I think we need to be more aware. We just when we are in school or in university, we're just reading those images because we have questions to answer, kind of a thing. But they're always there. It depends on us how we react and how we look at them.
Okay, thank you very much. That was really very insightful. Shumanali, we would like to know your views in this regard. If you could talk a little on poetry as a lighthouse of, transcendent human values in raising environmental sensibility.
I I'll take off from where Nishi said. I think you had phrased your question as the poets of the poems that one read as a child, and how one became an environmentally conscious person. I think, Deyasini, I will not really be able to give you an honest answer to this question. It's because I really can't years of my school life. So my education was through Tagore, Shohojpat, and the child rhymes. Uh, because we are discussing floods, let me limit myself to the subject. It was impossible for me, even as a child, I'm sure. And I noticed this also when I was reading these poems, or not reading, but saying these poems aloud with my nephew, who's now 9 years old. It was impossible not to internalize the sound of rain in Bangla. I brishti chepe, dhan debo mepe, dhaner moddhe poka. And then I used to name whoever I did not like at that point of time as boka. Uh, so even if you don't really know Bangla, as I'm sure many members of the audience or people listening in at this moment might not, you get a sense of the sound of the rain. And in this I brishti chepe, dhan debo mepe, I've always associated this with a sense of the rain. I can hear the rain coming and it's not reached me completely, but it's going to get here. Uh, you don't have to know Bangla to feel the rhythm of the rain falling on the tin roof, for instance. Uh, but the rain wasn't always joy. For soon enough, in the Tapur Tupur books that I read and now children read, there is this chora. বৃষ্টি পরে টাপুর টুপুর নদে এলো বান শিব ঠাকুরের বিয়ে হলো তিন কন্যে দান এক কন্যে রাধেন বাড়েন এক কন্যে খান এক কন্যে রাগ করে বাপের বাড়ি যান. So it's about many things that I will not translate, but this word stands out. Ban, bonna. Imagine the word flood occurring in a child rhyme. That is unusual, and that there is no escape from this awareness of floods in our child rhymes. Um, and the awareness that a flood could happen anytime. And one doesn't read anything, as Nishidi said, and certainly not as a child, particularly in the kind of careless childhood that I had, to read poets writing specifically on the environment. There are the child rhymes. And while reading the child rhymes, you wonder why the English rain is pitter patter and the Bengali rain kaput tupur. Why the difference in vowel sounds, though the consonants are the same? Then there is Tagore and his songs about the rain. That too seeps into your consciousness as well, without our awareness, of course. And because you asked about how I came into writing about, say, the elements or plant life, I began writing about what is now called the non-human, though I'm never aware of any such distinction in my own consciousness because of my relationship with plant life and the elements, not from an urge to save the environment. This is partly because I don't believe in this distinction about nature being outside me. I am as much nature as this plant behind me, or water, or sunlight is. I have been reading the Upanishads, for instance, very recently, in fact, a little while ago before this program began. And I was thinking that our ancients knew that we were composed of the elements and therefore had some kind of reciprocal relationship with the elements, some kind of colonial education. And I would like to think when this could have possibly begun, made this particularly exacerbated by the American idea of nature as a weekend activity that you enjoy on, a Saturday or Sunday, as a summer school project, as something in a scrapbook. No, all of us are nature. And so, yeah, I think I've been speaking for a long time. I want to listen to what Shelly has to say, of course.
Thank you, Shumanadi. It's wonderful listening to you. Shelly, if you could offer us a little insight on the role of poetry leading to an environmental awakening.
I was just so happy listening to Sumana because she lives in the awareness of nature as a part of nature, not outside nature. But many of us don't, because many of us are not sensitized as well as Sumana is, or many poets are, or we are through poems. So a few days ago, I had Tenzin Sundu, a Tibetan poet, he joined my class of my post-graduation class at the University of São Paulo. And he said he has one mantra about poetry, that poetry, it touches your heart and changes your mind. I think this is the role of poetry. It's like My stomach is a part of my body, but I'm not conscious about it unless I feel hunger. I feel hungry. So poetry is this hunger that makes the stomach comes alive. I feel itch on my back. I'm not aware of my back, that I have a back to me all the time. But when I have an itch on my back, I move my hand back. So poetry is that itch that prompts me to act. There's a drop of rain that falls on my cheek, and I look up at the sky. So poetry is that drop of rain that makes you look at it, look up at the sky, look up at nature. This is how poetry touches you. It impacts you. It makes you aware of your surrounding. It makes you feel yourself a part of it. Makes you act. This is where I think poetry has a role to play. And we have to pay attention when we listen to poetry, or when we listen to songs, as Nishi ma'am said, as Nishi said very well in her response. So that's what I have to say about the role of poetry in raising environmental activism.
Thank you, Shelly D, for that wonderful answer. Okay, moving on to my next question. The focus is on the impact of floods. Uh, so, hydrological disasters, being a frequent occurrence, are a constant reminder of the current global ecological crisis that floods causes rampant destruction to every ecosystem may be considered a curse, but it also comes back as a blessing multiplied. So, how have you been impacted by floods, and did that find a home in your writings, Shuman?
Me, Deyasini,
Yes,
um, I would have liked to say
you.
something a little more to add to what Shelley said, but I'll come back to that later. Deyasini, I feel like an imposter, a bit of an imposter being on this panel, because I've never been in a life endangering flood. And perhaps consequently, because of this, I've never been able to write about flood. Having friends and relatives who have lost family and homes and pets and birth certificates and Madhyamik mark sheets to floods, I know of this only secondhand. That limitation and the awareness of the real risks and dangers of floods has perhaps prevented me from even using the word as a metaphor or in a turn of phrase. I cannot remember, for instance, if I've ever used a sentence like, her eyes were flooded with tears. Yet, I have lived in Shiliguri, a sub Himalayan town in North Bengal. The first house that my parents could afford to buy when they moved to the small town in the late 1970s was in a very low lying region. My brother and I would not often be able to go to school because rains meant waterlogging. And this would often stretch into days and days into weeks because it does rain heavily here in northern Bengal. The kitchen would be flooded, there would be no electricity, everything would have to be piled onto our beds, our books, our clothes, all our belongings. In the morning, we would find someone's hari and korai, the cooking pot and wok, floating in the water in our courtyard. Some of ours from our kitchen would have migrated to some other place as well. This was a disturbance and fear for a few days every year. But people like me really didn't live through floods like my father's family had done. Also, my father at that time was a rural development officer in a nationalized bank when I was little. Being posted in these flooded towns and villages in northern Bengal, in Jalpaiguri and Alipurduar and Kuch Bihar districts, often meant that we had no news of him for days. Not only was there no telephone connection, he wouldn't be home on Saturday evening. Uh, I've never been able to write about the flood from some generational fear or trauma of water. I still shiver thinking of my mother's closest friend in college, whom I used to call Kumkumashi, when I hear the word flood. My parents were students in Calcutta in 1968, when the terrible flood in the Tista occurred. Kumkumashi was from Jalpaiguri. She could not come home. When she did at last, she had lost her entire family. Later, in fact, about 5 years ago, I would discover that this was a flood that could have been avoided had the men responsible for keeping people safe acted more responsibly. Uh, my husband was born a little less than a week before the flood. So, actually, exactly 7 days before the flood of 1968. His father, who had been away in Calcutta on some work, couldn't return home to Shiliguri because all road and rail connections had been destroyed. Uh, for some reason, there's a great silence in our art and cinema in Bengal, even our music and in our literature about this catastrophic event. Part of the reason I think might be to do with finding a vocabulary to match the scale of the event. And much of this, I wish I had the time to share this with you. Much of this could have been avoided had people who were in charge of communication been alert. The 2nd of October, when the water in the Tista began to rise, happened to coincide with the Durga Puja. A few days after the Durga Puja, when, as you know, there is a holiday for at least 4 to 5 days. Had the officials not been on leave or vacation or away from the Jalpaiguri district, this flood could have been avoided. So, 1968, as you will know, is also the time, the Nakshal variant, that everything is happening at around that time. So much of our attention has been spent on the Naxalbari uprising, but so little on this. Perhaps it also has to do with the government's lack of or its decision not to take responsibility for such an event. Again, because you said, how has it impacted my writing? And I was thinking, because I've never written anything on the flood, I was going through a report written by a government official, an administrator called Mr. S.N. Ray, and his report of the events of 2nd to 4th October 1968 reads like a thriller. It sounds very cheap of me to say that so many lives were destroyed, but he's documenting how the banks are being flooded, how towns are being swallowed, and so on. So, when we say that fact is stranger than fiction, these are the moments that I'm reminded of, particularly when we think of floods.
Thank you, Shimani. That's wonderful, really wonderful answer. Uh, Moving on to Shelly, would you share with us the impact it had on you?
Um, when you asked Sumana about the memories of flood, I had a flood of memories coming to me. A flood of memories of living by a very angry, aggressive, roaring Satluj River in Himachal Pradesh, in a place called Rampur Bushehr, which was very difficult terrain and very not very easy to reach there. So my father was posted there, and I lived by the riverside. That was long time back when we didn't have the refrigerators at home in Shimla where I lived. So I was not used to that noise all the time at home. We didn't have fans in Shimla because we never needed fans. So Satluj River, they made that noise that kept me awake the entire nights. I stayed awake the whole night because I just couldn't sleep because of that sound, that noise. It is only when I got back to Shimla and we had a refrigerator at home, a fridge, a modern fridge so called, it became easy for me because the sound of Satluj River had made me used to sleeping at night with some kind of sound in the backdrop. Because in Shimla we had pin drop silence, or to the most we had sound of barking dogs. Uh, so what I remember is the memory that comes to me is of living by that riverside and the very small details that I observed when I was 6 or 7 year old girl. And what comes to my mind is that those details are erased because that place was flooded. The Satluj was flooded. All those details are erased, but they are in my memory. Those details live in my memory. So not only with those details, there were families who were living, these poor families who were living by the riverside. Their households, their work. For example, some people they had this, we call it in village we call it gharat. चक्की, वो गाँव की चक्की, वो नदी का पानी लेके लहर निकाल के आटा पीसते हैं, और उससे वो अपना घर का खर्चा चलाते हैं। उनकी चक्की पानी में बह गई। सो आई केप्ट थिंकिंग अबाउट दिस पीपल इवन व्हेन आई वाज सो यंग, दैट has still stayed with me. As far as its impact on my poetry, I do not know consciously. I've never written a poem on floods as such, but I believe that everything that we experience and we internalize and we remember, it seeps into our works in some or the other way. So there must be some kind of implicit references to flood, or my memories connected to flood in my poetry. Late poet Manglesh Dabral, who was snatched by us last year because this coronavirus thing, it snatched him away. Coronavirus. I'm sorry, I have a sometimes very Portuguese pronunciation of words now. So he read my poems and he said that in poems you have cliches. You have cliches in your poems, and these cliches I must have borrowed from the poems and the memories of floods that I have of other people, that the memes that I've seen. And he also said that there are also new ways of imagining the nature and connecting with the nature. So I think I would leave it for you to read my poetry and tell me if you see there's an impact of my memories of the river, living by the riverside, and how everything that got erased and but still is in my mind is also in my poems. So I will let it for you to discover in my poems.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shelly B. Moving on to Nishi B, would you share with us your experiences of having impacted by floods, and if you have given shape to it?
I just have to continue what Sumana said. Even I am a complete imposter out here because I have not been able to write about, I have not written about floods anywhere in any of my poems because I have not seen the kind, or I have not experienced floods. It has not affected my life in that way. And I just I think I was reminded of my childhood memory of the 1978 floods in Kolkata, and I just have one memory of that, and that is that we had holidays. We didn't have to go to school. That is the only kind of memory that I have. So I have not seen the destruction caused firsthand. I've not seen the wrecking that it has done to lives. Yes, I do get to read. Last year, of course, when Amphan, I mean, it was not a flood, but it was a big natural calamity. But when Amphan had hit South 24 Parganas and Kolkata, we had a carer for my mother who belonged to Namkhana. And the day that Amphan had struck, actually, she was around this time, around 7 or so, she was talking with her, brother at home. She was here with us. And then suddenly the line went off and she told me that Bari chhad pure geche. The roof of her house, it just flew off. And at that point of time, I feel a sense of helplessness. There were children in the house, there were babies in the house. So that is the closest that I could have come to, any such calamity. And I really didn't understand how she was reacting to it, because for 3 days she had no news about her family, absolutely no news, because she told me that network nahi. So they absolutely cut off. So for 3 days, she doesn't even know how her 8-year-old son is doing, where they are. And I felt at that point of time it did affect me a lot, but I could not write poetry. I didn't do it. I wrote an essay where I spoke about, an Amphan happened during COVID times. So I wrote about that. I wrote about what was happening to me that particular evening. I've never been able to write poetry about it, because as Shubhana said, as Shelly also said, we've not been affected by it, that we've not seen the destruction caused by it. All I have got to know is I read or just see visuals of picture images right now over the news. These times when we were young, we didn't even get that. But that's my whole interaction with floods. So I have really not been able to write about floods. I find it difficult to write about things which cause. I mean, it's not as if I don't, but I do write. But it does cause a lot of problems. But with floods, I've never been able. I think I've not even used metaphors of floods, as Shimona also says. I've
Sumana.
not been able to use. Yes.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much, ma'am. Moving on to my next question. Poems are the real enactment of environmental reality, and it transforms reality into a sensible reality. So, if you could talk um, or tell us how your poetry brings up certain factors of the environment and who you first read as a child has awakened your environmental sensibilities. Also, would you like to recite any such poem for us, Shelley?
Ah, okay. Deyasini, when you talk about the poem, the poets we read as children and what we read, I'll tell you something that I have never said in a public platform like this. Very unexpected of writers. No, it is expected of writers that they read a lot of books when they're children. I never read books when I was a child because I was very scared of books. Every time I open books, words, they would float up and down the page. Today I like to talk about it as a kind of like, the alphabets, words, they are birds that would just fly on the vastness of the page. That time I didn't understand what was happening, and I was told I have a problem of eyesight or a strain. So years later, I got to know that I am dyslexic. But I was less scared of poetry. You know why? Because poetry simply meant less words on the page. And poetry had this element of this musicality, which somehow I believe also alleviated the anxiety of having to deal with words when I was a child. So even when I did not read books when I was a child, I read poetry. And some of the poems, the poems that I remember the most are the poems that are connected to nature. The poems I read at school. I still remember that poem, Satpura Ke Jangal, Bhavani Prasad Mishra, right? Poem Satpura Ke Jangal. And I had this box in my home. I found a very old box at my home, एक डब्बा, लकड़ी का डब्बा, जिसके अंदर बहुत सारी books भरी पड़ी थी. So my dad was doing his masters in English once upon a time, but he gave up. So that box had all this canonical literature. And in that literature, there were so many books, but the book that I picked up and I kept with me as a child was this poem by Romantics. Because I connected with that poetry because I was living in the countryside. I was myself living there. So I believe that, sorry, I think I forgot your question. Your question is about the poets that we read. I think
Yeah, poets you read as a child that has awakened your environmental sensibilities, and also how your poetry brings up, certain aspects of the environment.
Okay, so I became a very environment conscious individual because of the poems I read, because those poems made me see my environment in a new light. And I also became environment conscious individual because of the tourists that came to my small village, in a chota sa gaon, Mashobra in Shimla, periphery of Shimla, where we lived, where we didn't have modern bathrooms, and we went to jungles very often. We had that kind of communion with nature. And that time we didn't fear, because we only feared animals, because we lived in a very safe society at that time. So we littered around. We ourselves, हम लोग भी यहाँ पे टॉफी खाए, छिलका नीचे फेंक दिया, कवर नीचे फेंक दिया. We used to litter around. But the jungles were so vast, the valleys were so vast that it didn't matter, and we were so little. But when came the first hotel in Mashobra, and that hotel brought tourists, and tourists began to litter around, we became aware of our own dirty habits of littering around. So that made me environment conscious. Other than the poems that I read, that made me see nature in a new light. The tourists who came made me look back at my own dirty habits, my own carelessness. That's how I slowly became conscious about the environment. And then when I moved to the city, there was a stark contrast between the village and the city. The level of oxygen, the quality of oxygen available in city and the village. So this kind of contrast made me very conscious about my environment. And now even if I'm living in Sao Paulo on the 14th floor of a high-rise building, that village stays in my head with me. That environment is inside my head. It stays with me, and I'm always be conscious about my environment. As to poems, I think I will have to. I did not take my book. I have to bring my book here to read a
Sure, sure.
poem that has. So I
Yes,
think I
please.
just
Yeah, we'll wait for you.
All
Yeah,
right, all right.
we'll wait
So
for you.
maybe you can ask other people the question, and meanwhile, I'll get my book and see if I
Ah,
can read a poem
okay,
from it.
okay, okay. Yeah, so Nishini, if you could share with us how your poetry unravels the ecological aspects of environment. Also, I believe that a child has an extraordinary mind and extraordinary sensibility to envision the perennial beauties of life. So, uh, even I'll ask you the same. Would you recite a poem for us that you first read and that taught you love, compassion, empathy, made you an environment conscious individual?
I don't think the poems that I read, when I was growing up, really contributed to, at that point of time when I was reading them. I don't think I, thought about them in terms of environment consciousness, or
Right.
that it was telling me something about nature, something to look out and something to learn about nature. I don't recollect my reading of poetry telling me that. My consciousness about the environment, my consciousness about ecology is something which came much later on, much later on. And that finds expression in what I do, in what I write, how I write. But I really do not recollect any childhood poem telling me something about nature and the natural. I mean, telling me about, you know, uh, the environment and how I care about it. Uh, my childhood memory about trees are the flower pots that my mother had, in the backyard. A few, you live in a flat in an urban para, so you don't have much space, or the small little patch of green just outside the veranda where the neighbor, I used to call him Nikhil Mama, who used to look after these plants. Most of these plants were not planted, they just grew. There was a mango tree which came up because a mango seed had been dropped there, and that used to cause us problems during summer because school children who passed by used to hit stones, and the stones used to fall in our veranda. So that is my memory of trees. I really don't think of that time when poetry made me conscious. I think this consciousness about the environment, about ecology, is something which came in much later on. And living in a concrete jungle, I so loved Shelly talking about Shimla and Mashobra. I have wonderful memories of spending a month in Shimla for 2 consecutive years, and that's another world, right? And living in Kolkata in an urban concrete jungle, you don't get to see green at all. Right. So whatever little bit of green I get to see through my window, I have an empty, vacant plot just beside the window, and that plot is all wild. And if you, from my window, it looks very good, nice because it's all green. But it's otherwise wild and pretty dirty as well because most people around throw their garbage, but from my window, it looks very green. And if I click a picture of that, you would think that I live in such a nice environment, but that's not how it is. So that little bit of green that you see there, that I see, or the few plants that I put in, in a few spot somewhere just behind or in my room somewhere. That is the only bit of green that I get to see. A few days ago, we just took some pumpkin seeds and planted it casually. Let's see. And I'm very happy to see that it has grown this much. I'm not sure. I'm not expecting a pumpkin either. But yes, I would like to see one flower at least. It makes me feel nice. So that's about the green that works around me. And I'm otherwise, we don't have green. I mean, Sumana is located in a much more nicer place where, there could be more green. But here in Kolkata, just So whatever I talk about, or in my poetry, or whatever I write about, is basically about these small um, little patches. I wouldn't even say patches. They're just small little dots of green that one tries to you know, work on. That's it. So yes, but I do love writing about, when I see my plants, those little ones, or something that reminds me of some other green place, that I do like to write about. And I feel nice, to see the plants thriving so well, and sometimes not thriving as well. So but it feels nice. But the older, the childhood memories, I really don't recollect poems, kind of making me involved. But I do think the school did play an important role, because in school you are taught otherwise, about the environment and so on, but not through poetry. We were reading poetry because we had it part of our syllabus, but I don't recall the use of poetry. But I think it would be nice if children could read about poems as telling them about the environment. And you want me to read a poem?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Since I've been talking about the pumpkin, so I'll just see if I can find that poem, and maybe read that poem. It's a short poem. Uh, yeah. So, right. This is about that pumpkin tree, which a few lines which I wrote down a week ago or so. And this is how it goes. I call it the pumpkin plant that slowly emerges. And this is how it goes. They are cleaned, chopped, diced, and cut. The orange yellow pieces, not very large, not very small, they line the steel plate waiting to be transformed. The skin on the paper, the seeds mixed in, messy as they lay for a while. Wash them, she says, let them dry for a while. I look at her and smile. Into the soil, hidden for some time, forgotten too, as we go on with things. Two green leaves stand out, bending a little, shining in the blazing sun, not yet creeping. So,
Wow,
a few lines.
beautiful. Beautiful.
So,
Very
thank you.
beautiful. Okay. Thank you very much, ma'am. Shelly Didi, I think you've got the book.
Yeah, I got
Yeah.
my book. And actually, there are many poems that have reflection of nature. But I choose to read a poem, Meaning Making, in which you will see children and you will see children as nature. You will not see children as human beings, but as part of nature, or human beings who are part of nature, not distance from nature. So this poem is called Meaning Making. It was about then when we didn't understand what it is and set out into meaning making exercises. I gently stole a strand of hair from my classmate's blazer and pulled one mine to juxtapose to in sunshine. A few more strands got pulled and stolen. Then my head scratched to not understand how some hair could be thin and some not. My talkative twin chased words that danced on elders' lips and struggled to speak every split second the lips seal that she should be speaking now because she has understood a conversation at the end of which she was allowed to speak means a word. The father's face became red while the mother tapped her forehead. We traced the patterns of O, C, in the moon, why in the trees we climbed, we, W and M, in valleys and mountains we saw, hanging from the trees upside down. The mountains a few walks away on our last birthday, the huge mountains a few walks away on our last birthday appeared distant now. The grandfather explained the phenomenon of a growing tall. We settled down to writing when my twin rhymed flower with shower. I wrote, a smiling flower in the rain shower. We tried to bring in even power. Then we discovered the dictionary and began replacing condition with predicament. Predicament. The rhyming became inexpedient as meanings socialized. Those unpublishable poems and experiential meanings had a joy lost to us, like those years we have grown up to understand what it is, and that my twin never was nor will be. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank
So
you. Thank
happy
you,
to
Shelly.
listen to you recite again, Shelly, after so many years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure.
Uh, okay, so moving on to Shumana, could you offer us a little insight on how your poetry is resonance of certain environmental factors that opens the gateway to the quintessence of life, and we would love to hear you recite a poem for us.
Yeah, you know what Nishidi said. I'm completely in agreement with that. One doesn't read with any kind of consciousness when one is a child. I think even as adults, we don't. Academics do that. Their reading is instrumental. We force students to kind of, behave like anglers looking for something in a text. Life teaches you how to fall in love. Not necessarily, you don't go to a love poem to learn how to fall in love. A love poem is not an instruction manual. Uh, Similarly, with the poems that we read as children, I mentioned the chora, the Bangla chora, the child rhymes. Because Nishidi mentioned the rhyme of the ancient mariner, I was also thinking of two very simple, seemingly simple Wordsworth poems, the solitary reaper, and what is called, the cloud. Though that's not the title, as we know. I wandered lonely as a cloud. Somewhere in that poem, you encounter this phrase, host of golden daffodils. 10,000 saw I at once. What does the word 10,000 do? And I always wondered, did the poet count? And we know it's a phrase used for the uncountable. Poetry is kavya. It's an uncountable noun. So love is uncountable too. Poetry will not be able to teach you how to love unless you are receptive in many ways. Um, as I grew older, I think I began to tire of something, and I want to share this with you before I read. I think the vocabulary of environmental activism, and I really don't like that phrase. Every time you put activism after a word, the word and its possibilities lose meaning. Imagine if there was something like love activism. I would find it as ugly as the phrase love jihad. I'd prefer something a little more organic, something more intimate. And so I think the language of environmental activism, if it has to be efficient, needs to change. It has to move from being a very bureaucratic language to one of life and living and life lovingness. No one, as we know, has ever saved a tree because they have found saved trees nailed onto the body of a tree. We must work towards, whether as poet or not, I think all of us who care for something must work towards replacing this language of instruction and this language of morality, where you say you must plant trees because it is good for the planet, and the language of utilitarianism. If you plant trees, you get oxygen. With the language of real relationships, of the value and worth of relationships, the kind of relationship that Nishidi has with the pumpkin seeds, the surprise that she's expecting, uh, the suddenness that shared with us about the river Sutlej, for instance, the unexpectedness. These, you usually don't eat your pets. That is because of the relationship you have formed with them. Poet can change the language of information and bureaucracy to a language of involvement, intimacy, and care. Uh, and thank you. And because you asked me to read something in a book that I wrote, it's not a plug, so forgive me. It's just because it's environmental activism. In a book that I wrote called How I Became a Tree, I was looking for, such as myself, humans who had expressed the desire to live like a tree. In the poems that I began to write around the same period and the ones and the time that has followed since then, I find that my journey has been the opposite. It was for the human to leave the social and to enter the place of plant life in How I Became a Tree. In these poems, I find that I want to see how the trees might behave if they were brought into the human social condition. Uh, this poem is called, just a second, it's called How to Console a Dying Plant. And as you might notice, I'm trying to get a plant into a setting that is very social. And anyway, I'm not going to talk about my poem. So it's called How to Console a Dying Plant. What we actually mourn is our turning to meat. So you must never take a mirror to the dying, for reflecting surfaces can't hold the fading of flesh, or even fatigue, whose destiny is to never be in anyone's earshot. The props you know are of little use. What use are the scriptures or the drumbeat of last wishes to a plant, or a hand and its show of genres, patting, holding, and then leaving? You touch the stem from time to time, your fingers a stethoscope. You know so little. Between your heart and your head is a bed. You fall in love often. Every day, the bed turns a little more into a coffin. Every day, the plant turns a little more into an aged radio. It will lose signal soon. Blood, stillness, the stop of the nostril fan, these you've known as death. But this is a foreign language. The loss of leaves, the softness of hard stem, the collapse of the dignified vertical into the battle lost horizontal, and the worst, the complete rejection of water, as if it was poison or an unfamiliar dialect. Death is so prolific, the death of plants, a permanent epidemic. How do you console those who do not know the fear of uncertainty? You look for an aperture, something like an ear, so that your words can enter the tree like an insect. You fail, and you wonder whether insects are better consolers. You think of things to say, the afterlife, cremation, the crowded energies of a funeral, photographs in an album. You stammer. What use are these to plants, to anyone? You want to make promises about looking after its family, swift death certificates, and life insurance policies. Instead, you look at the withering trunk, think of how a tree has no spare parts, no organ transplants. Death is a tussle between law and justice. This trees know neither, nothing except standing. You can't console, you can't tidy life's vanity. For the tree, death is only an impurity. Thank you.
Such a wonderful rendition, Shumari, and such a brilliant poem that was. Uh, okay, so this will be my last question. Uh, do you think uh, Edward Albert's title, Return to Nature, would again become significant to a highly intellectual, tech oriented generation for a snap of time to breathe and ponder so that they can renew their enthusiasm with time to parallel the pragmatism required to survive in the 21st century? Nishima, sorry, Nishidi.
Thank you for that. Uh, I wish it would, and maybe we would we would be conscious about the world that we live in and the changes that urbanization and all the other kind of changes that are coming in. Uh, but for that, each of us have to be conscious about the world around and so it cannot be I'm not sure how that can be done or whether it can be done. I hope it can be done, and I hope that people maybe because I think that as we've all been talking, we have not I have not been that environmentally conscious earlier on the way I am right now, or the kind of relation with nature that I have right now is very different from what I had when I was much younger. So maybe the people who are young at now would, I think it takes time for this realization to come in, how the environment and how whatever bit of nature that we can have around us is going to, it's going to help. So I think maybe, I wouldn't want to give up hope completely. So I think it would, but if for that, we need the consciousness to develop. And I think young people today would, think about the environment. And given the fact that we've been going through a terrible time, and we've often been talking about how, and at least last year, this year, we've been too caught up with so much happening around us. But last year, I do remember people talking about how blue the sky was looking, bluer than before, and how the air seems to be much less polluted. We were doing that last year. We couldn't. I have not been able to do that this year at all because things have been really very very bad. But I think maybe that little bit of consciousness somewhere would, in the long run, maybe because there have always been times when people have reacted positively to nature. So we just need to wait and watch. And I think people, young people, would ultimately maybe be react positively to the environment, to nature, and hopefully we will be able to maintain the status quo at least.
All right. Thank you very much, Shri, for that lovely answer. Moving on to Shomanadi, we would like to know your views in this regard.
Uh, as I said in my response a little while ago, Deyasini, I think the narrative has to change, the vocabulary has to change. What we have now today is either a very instructional narrative, as I said, or a utilitarian one. But most common among these is an apocalyptic narrative. You know, reinforced by in the manner of Hollywood movies, where if you don't look after nature, this is going to happen, and so on and so forth. From our own experience of losing friends and relatives and family to COVID, We now know that anxiety after a point of time and loss deadens us. It becomes a number. So when I first lost my Boropishi and her entire family, I could not think of anything else for days. Then a cousin of mine lost half of her family. That affected me. But it's like, I'm sorry for bringing in this term in this very crass way, but it's to me, it seems like, the law of diminishing marginal utility, where it gradually becomes your sense, you lose sensitivity to this kind of bad news happening around you all the time. And you think, oh, one more day and one more. It doesn't affect you the way the first death of someone close to you did. The apocalyptic narrative behaves in exactly the same way. After a point, you are not moved by anxiety. You are not moved. We also have this narrative about you must do it for your children, or for the next generation. Quite clearly, this has not been helping anyone, neither to change our lifestyles or anything of the kind. As I said before, what we need is a vocabulary and a narrative that reinforces relationships, that where you share a kind of intimacy with not just humans, but a world in which, as our ancients knew, the tree was as valuable, a tree was as valuable as a dog. As you think of our epics, you think of even the bhakti poets, who are writing any kind of literature that comes to us from our ancients, in whichever culture it might be. There are so many quote unquote non humans, and they have no awareness of these being non humans. And you look at our novels today and how human centric they are. You don't want to read a novel which is not about humans. As soon as it is about something else besides the human, the publisher finds a different category. It goes into nature writing, and you go to the nature writing bookshelf as if it was the last period on Friday, which was moral science class in my school. That, it's something that needs to be done, and, I just need to get a pass grade for this. Or you feel very good, like eating some kind of organic food, that this is good for my body, and this is my way of saving the earth, as it were. The earth doesn't need to be saved. When we say save the earth, we actually mean we want to save it for us, because I'm quite sure other species will survive us. In saving the earth also is a kind of very selfish anthropocentrism. I cannot repeat this enough. If we are able, and I saw this happening with my nephew, as soon as I was able to make him feel that he was as responsible for taking care of a bougainvillea plant as he was of his 2-year-old sister, his relationship with the plant changed. And it is as simple as that. And I'm sure all of us do that, you know. So it's not in a manner of switch off the lights or switch off the fans. It's something much more intimate. When these people, when it becomes a member of your family, so you will see there are dried twigs here that I've collected from a tea estate. But my nephew came in and scolded me how I had let these twigs die. So I told him, but I had gathered them, when they were already dry and dead. But he wouldn't believe me. He thought I was irresponsible. So to make all of us caregivers to what exists just outside us, not in any bureaucratic manner. I think that is the only possible way that I am not a scientist. I am not an environmentalist. I'm just a lover. And I think love will save us. Love will save everyone if only we loved. We need a pedagogy of love. We need a politics of love. We need a vocabulary of love.
Beautiful.
Beautiful, beautiful. Uh, Thank you, Shumanati, for that enlightening answer. Uh, so moving on to Shelly. Shelly, could you offer us some insight on that?
Yeah, Deyasini, since you talked about the return to nature vis-a-vis the very e-tech generation, you know what I really feel that we have a need to return to our bodies because we have lost touch with our bodies. We treat our bodies as our bodies are machines, they're robots. You know, especially in this pandemic time. We have had a lot of development in the world from beginning. If you go back to the history of our human history, from being nomads, we began to have agriculture. We set up villages. We moved to having cities. We have had a lot of development, but this development is disempowering development. This is what we don't realize. First, we offered nature at the altar of human material development, and now we are offering our bodies. We're feeding our bodies, at the altar of this digitalization of our work lives and even relationships to that extent. I, I'm writing a poem about this pandemic, and I would like to say this that in this pandemic, the human tree has entered a very deep autumnal phase where bodies are falling off like leaves, uncountable, without any count of it. At the same time, we have become so digitalized in our quarantines, in our lockdowns, that we have also forgotten our bodies. We have lost touch with our bodies. And I fear that in the post pandemic times, this kind of life culture, this kind of a new lifestyle will continue because of the sheer ease of it. Because now we don't have to, we save time on traveling, we save money on when we work from home. So there is some ease, and because of this ease, this comfort, we might continue this kind of a lifestyle, but it is not a very healthy lifestyle despite some benefits we have from this. It's not good for our bodies. So what will happen is that, just imagine we go to the countryside, like nature's a holiday destination. We will treat our bodies as holiday destination, that we have to hit the gym thrice a week to control our cholesterols. Just imagine if your body, instead of you go to retreat in a place, your body becomes a place of some kind of a monthly or an annual retreat, not a living organism. We need to protect ourselves and the increasingly digitalized generations of my children's age. We need to protect that. We need to do that. And how do we do that? As Shumona very rightly said, we do that by making us all responsible, all capable of caring, loving, connecting. So that's what I think is very, very important. That return to nature also involves returning to our bodies and feeling it as an elemental part of this nature. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Shalini. That was a really insightful answer. Okay, so before I call upon Momita to end the session, I would like to read out a letter. So this is a letter to my future self, and I assume my future self to be a tree. So here I go. Shimon is
No, that was nothing. I'm so interested because I really want to know what you want to say. Yeah, of course.
okay. Okay. So here I go. Dear tree, I know you go one day to heights I can never imagine. You will have dark brown streaming branches of Baba's tender eyes, where trumpet petals fly edged on to build their a cataract umbilical stream, star-shadowed black, will bind your roots to Earth's bosom as they intensify their hold and fan out like reaching arms of glistening raindrops. You will give many fruits and love, shade and smell, love and lullaby, sight and touch. Can you ever forget the love that runs in your blood forever? You will give love's me mud, cotton soft, full white rotten back, and I shall bring baskets of its syrup smell just for you. scattering them like strong birds. They smell of happiness, but of sadness more. You will wrap me in the dawn mother of Mars touch, and sometimes in Mars scorched orange coals at noon, dripping under your steam. You will give Mars reach of red hibiscus that will unpick and sleep side of at you will give a handful of fresh air, savory, cucumber, and flowing in my blood, a palatial garden house, lit up by evening lamps at dusk. I'll stay there and live in songs under your cold breath, in the silent streets, in the hearts of my in the songs of you, and glinting in the stars of the sky without bound. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very beautiful. Deyasini,
Thank you,
thank you
Deyasini.
so much for these wonderful questions, and congratulations to TMYS Academy. And I think it's very important to talk about floods. It's an area that is like not really, it's an ignored, it's an underexplored area. So thank you so much for this beautiful work that you all are doing. Congratulations and thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all of you, for your extremely knowledgeable insights. Thank you very much.
That was
It's been a
beautiful,
pleasure.
Deyasini, and you recited very beautifully as well.
Thank you.
Thank you to Coral and to Momita and all of you here for getting us here. I was very happy to see Shelly again after so many years and to meet Deyasini, Momita, and Nishibi in this way. Hopefully, life will give us more opportunities to sit opposite each other and not just adjacent to each other like we are on a Zoom screen at this moment.
Yes, that was really very nice, Deyasini.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been a wonderful evening talking to Sumana, Shelly, and you, and thank you to Momita and Coral.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for such a lovely and enriching conversation. That's really nice to listen to your experiences and recitations. And yes, we look forward for submissions of stories, essays, and poems on displacement and rehabilitation of flood victims under TMYS Review September 2021. Please stay safe, take good care of yourself. Thank you. Good night.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Bye bye.